Eleanor Whitmore ran through the rain with her heart pounding, clutching a letter that could ruin everything she had built. Behind her, the sound of horses grew louder. She did not look back. She could not. If the riders caught her before she reached the estate gates, the truth she carried would never reach the one person who needed to hear it. She had left London 3 days ago, with nothing but a small trunk and a promise to herself that she would not fail. Now, soaked to the bone and gasping for air, she pushed through the iron gates of Ashcombe Hall, just as the storm broke fully over the hills. A guard shouted for her to stop. She ignored him and kept running toward the great house, her boots slipping on the wet gravel. It was in this state, breathless and half-drowned, that she first came face to face with Duke Alexander Ashcombe. He stood on the front steps of his home, tall and unmoving, his dark coat catching the wind. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, studied her, as though she were a stranger who had wandered onto his land without permission, which, in fairness, was exactly what she was. "Who are you?" he said, not as a question, but as a demand. "And why are my men chasing you across my own property?" Eleanor straightened her spine, though her legs still shook from the run. "I am the new governess for your sister," she said. "I was told to arrive by the western road, but the coach broke an axle 2 miles back. I walked the rest of the way." The Duke's eyes narrowed. In this weather, I had little choice. He did not offer her his hand, nor did he step aside to let her pass. Instead, he studied her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust the story or turn her away entirely. Eleanor held his gaze, refusing to look away first. She had learned long ago that the moment you looked down was the moment people decided you were beneath them. Finally, he stepped back and gestured toward the door. "Come inside before you catch your death. My housekeeper will see to you." It was not warmth. It was obligation, but it was enough. Inside, the hall was grand, in a way that made Eleanor feel smaller than she already did. Portraits of stern ancestors lined the walls, candles burned in silver holders, and the air smelled of polished wood and old stone. A woman in a gray dress appeared almost instantly, her expression pinched with disapproval at the sight of a stranger dripping onto the marble floor. "Mrs. Feld," the Duke said, "this is Miss Whitmore. She will be tutoring my sister. See that she is given dry clothes and a room." Mrs. Feld's eyes swept over Eleanor with clear judgment. "Yes, Your Grace." As the housekeeper led her away, Eleanor glanced back once. The Duke had already turned, disappearing into a room off the main hall, his shoulders stiff, his expression unreadable. She did not know yet what kind of man he was. She only knew that something about the way he looked at her, sharp and searching, had unsettled her more than the storm outside ever could. The room she was given was small but clean, tucked at the end of a corridor on the second floor. A fire had already been lit, and a plain gray dress had been laid out on the bed, likely a spare belonging to one of the maids. Eleanor changed quickly, wringing the rain from her hair, and sat by the fire trying to steady her breathing. She had come to Ashcombe Hall for one reason only. She needed the position, and she needed the wages it would bring. Her father had died the previous winter, leaving behind debts she had not known existed until the collectors came knocking. She had taken the first respectable position offered to her, not caring that it meant leaving everything familiar behind and traveling to a part of the country she had never seen, to serve a family she knew nothing about. She had heard whispers about the Duke before she arrived, that he was cold, that he had been betrayed by a woman he once intended to marry, and that the betrayal had hardened something in him that had never softened since. She had not expected to meet him so soon, nor under such chaotic circumstances, but there was little use dwelling on it now. A knock came at her door. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, peeked inside with wide, curious eyes. "Are you my new teacher?" the girl asked. Eleanor smiled despite her exhaustion. "I believe I am. My name is Eleanor." "I'm Margaret," the girl said, stepping fully into the room. "Everyone calls me Maggie, except my brother. He says nicknames are undignified." "Does he?" Eleanor said, amused. "He says a lot of things are undignified," Maggie said, rolling her eyes in the particular way only children can. "He wasn't always like this, you know. Mrs. Feld says he used to laugh all the time before Miss Carlyle left." Eleanor did not ask who Miss Carlyle was. She did not need to. The pieces fit together easily enough, and she had learned early in life that some subjects were better left untouched until trust had been built. "Well," Eleanor said instead, "perhaps we shall have to see if we can find something to laugh about ourselves." Maggie's answering smile was so genuine that Eleanor felt, for the first time since arriving, that she might actually belong here. Over the following days, Eleanor settled into the rhythm of the household. Mornings were spent teaching Maggie her letters and sums, afternoons were spent walking the gardens when the weather allowed, and evenings were spent alone in her room, reading by candlelight to avoid drawing attention to herself. She rarely saw the Duke, and when she did, their exchanges were brief and formal. He would nod when passing her in the hallway. He would ask, without truly seeming to care, whether Maggie was applying herself to her studies. He never lingered, never asked questions beyond what was necessary, and Eleanor told herself this suited her perfectly well. She had not come to Ashcombe Hall to make friends with a Duke who clearly wanted nothing to do with her beyond her usefulness to his sister. And yet, there were moments, small and fleeting, when she caught him watching her from across a room, his expression unreadable, before he quickly looked away, as though caught doing something he should not have been doing. She told herself it meant nothing. Dukes did not concern themselves with governesses, and governesses who forgot their place rarely kept their positions for long. It was nearly 2 weeks into her stay when the first real conversation between them occurred. She had been in the library searching for a book of simple stories to read with Maggie, when the Duke entered unexpectedly, clearly not anticipating anyone else to be there. He stopped short in the doorway, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Forgive me," Eleanor said quickly, stepping back from the shelf. "I did not mean to intrude. I was only looking for something for Maggie's lessons." "You are not intruding," he said, his voice quieter than she had heard it before. "This is a library. It is meant to be used." She nodded, unsure what else to say, and turned back to the shelf. She could feel his eyes on her as she searched, and the silence between them stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. "How is she?" he asked suddenly. "Maggie, is she applying herself?" "She is bright," Eleanor said honestly. "Brighter than she gives herself credit for. She simply needs encouragement, not correction. I think she has had enough correction in her life already." Something shifted in his expression, so briefly she almost missed it. "She lost her mother young," he said. "I have tried to do right by her, but I am not certain I know how." Eleanor turned to face him fully, surprised by the admission. It was the most personal thing he had said to her since her arrival, and she sensed it had cost him something to say it. "You are trying," Eleanor said gently. "That matters more than you think." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze made her chest tighten unexpectedly. "You speak plainly for someone in your position." "I have found that plain speech saves a great deal of time," Eleanor replied, "and misunderstandings." A faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth before he caught himself and let it fall away. "Perhaps," he said. "Good evening, Miss Whitmore." "Good evening, Your Grace." He left without another word, but Eleanor remained standing in the library long after he had gone, her heart beating strangely fast, for reasons she did not wish to examine too closely. She told herself it was simply the surprise of the conversation, nothing more. She told herself many things over the following days, most of which she did not fully believe. She did not yet know that the man she had just spoken with, the same man who kept himself so carefully guarded, had already begun to notice her, in ways he had not allowed himself to notice anyone in a very long time. She did not know that behind his closed study door, he sat some nights thinking of a governess who spoke too plainly and looked at him without fear, and wondered why the thought of her unsettled him more than anything had in years. She only knew that something had shifted between them in that quiet library, something small but undeniable, and that whatever it was, it would not be so easily ignored. That night, after Maggie had been put to bed and the house had grown quiet, Eleanor sat by her window, watching the last of the storm clouds drift away from the moon. She thought of her father, of the modest cottage they had shared before his passing, of the debts that had chased her from everything familiar. She had come to Ashcombe Hall seeking only safety and steady wages. She had not expected to find herself thinking, again and again, of a man's guarded eyes and the brief warmth in his voice when he spoke of his sister. She reminded herself firmly that a governess did not fall into foolish thoughts about her employer. Such thoughts led nowhere good. She had seen it happen to other women in her position, women who mistook a moment of kindness for something more, only to find themselves dismissed and disgraced when reality set in. She would not make that mistake. She would keep her thoughts practical, her manner professional, and her heart carefully guarded, just as the Duke seemed to guard his own. Yet even as she made this promise to herself, she found she could not stop replaying the sound of his voice in the library, quiet and unguarded, admitting that he did not know how to raise his sister alone. It was not the voice of a cold man. It was the voice of someone who had simply forgotten how to let anyone close enough to see otherwise. The weeks that followed brought a quiet rhythm to Ashcombe Hall, though beneath its surface, something had begun to shift. Eleanor noticed it first in small things. The Duke lingered a moment longer in the doorway of the schoolroom when he came to check on Maggie's progress. He began asking Eleanor's opinion on matters he had no real need to consult her about, whether a particular tutor should be brought in for music lessons, whether the gardens should be replanted before winter. She told herself these were simply the actions of a careful older brother wanting to be thorough. She did not allow herself to believe they were anything more. Maggie, for her part, blossomed under Eleanor's patient teaching. The girl who had once shrunk from correction now eagerly showed off her progress, reciting sums at dinner and reading passages aloud from her favorite stories, with growing confidence. Even Mrs. Feld, who had regarded Eleanor with suspicion upon her arrival, began to soften, offering her tea in the kitchen in the evenings and sharing small pieces of the household's history. It was from Mrs. Feld that Eleanor first learned more about the woman Maggie had mentioned that first day, the one called Miss Carlyle. She was to marry his grace, Mrs. Feld said one evening, stirring a pot of tea with more force than necessary. Everyone believed it settled. The banns were near ready to be read. Then, not 2 weeks before the wedding, she left with a wealthy merchant's son, and never so much as sent a letter of apology. Eleanor sat quietly, absorbing this. That must have been difficult for him. Difficult does not begin to cover it, Mrs. Feld said. He shut himself away for near a month. When he finally came out of it, he was a different man, colder, sharper. He has not let anyone close since, not truly, not until. She stopped herself, glancing at Eleanor with a knowing look before returning her attention to the tea. Until what? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew what the housekeeper had left unsaid. Nothing, Mrs. Feld said, though her small smile suggested otherwise. Drink your tea, Miss Whitmore, before it grows cold. Eleanor did not press further, but the conversation stayed with her long after she returned to her room that night. It explained so much about the man she had come to know these past weeks, his guarded silences, the way he seemed to measure every word before speaking it, the flicker of something raw and unhealed whenever the subject of marriage or courtship arose at dinner. She found herself wishing, foolishly, that she could ease some of that old hurt, though she reminded herself sternly that it was not her place to wish for any such thing. It was around this time that Lord Henry Ashford arrived at Ashcombe Hall. He came as a guest of the Duke's, an old acquaintance from his university years, though it was clear from the moment he stepped through the doors that his visit was not entirely one of friendship. He was charming, in an easy, practiced way, quick with compliments, and quicker still with his attention toward Eleanor the moment he learned who she was. A governess with such fine manners, he said at their first meeting, bowing over her hand with a flourish that made her want to laugh. You must have been raised in far grander circumstances than your current position suggests. My circumstances have always suited me well enough, my lord, Eleanor replied, gently withdrawing her hand. Modest as well as clever, Henry said, grinning. A rare combination indeed. Eleanor caught, from the corner of her eye, the Duke's expression darkening as he watched the exchange from across the room. She thought little of it at first, assuming it was simply his usual reserve. But as the days passed and Henry's attentions toward her grew bolder, she began to notice a pattern she could not ignore. Whenever Henry sought her out in the garden to discuss books or philosophy, the Duke would appear soon after, finding some sudden reason to require her presence elsewhere. Whenever Henry complimented her at dinner, the Duke's jaw would tighten, his replies growing clipped and short for the remainder of the evening. She told herself it was simply protectiveness, the natural instinct of a man looking after his sister's governess from an old friend, with a reputation for charm and little else. She told herself this, even as some quieter part of her began to wonder if there was more to it. One afternoon, while walking with Maggie through the gardens, they came upon Henry, seated on a stone bench, sketching idly in a small notebook. He rose immediately upon seeing them, tucking the notebook away. "Miss Whitmore," he said warmly, "and young Lady Margaret. What a pleasant surprise." "We were only walking, my lord," Eleanor said. "We did not mean to disturb you." "You could never disturb me," Henry said, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her faintly uncomfortable, though she could not have said precisely why. "In fact, I was hoping to find a moment alone with you. There is a matter I wish to discuss." Maggie, sensing the shift in conversation, tugged at Eleanor's sleeve. "May I go look at the roses, Miss Whitmore? I promise not to wander far." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before nodding, watching the girl skip off toward the rose bushes a short distance away, still well within sight. "What did you wish to discuss, my lord?" Eleanor asked, turning back to Henry. "I find myself quite taken with you, Miss Whitmore," Henry said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "I know it is unconventional, given your position here, but I wondered if you might permit me to call on you properly, once my visit concludes. I have connections that could see you settled far more comfortably than a governess's wages allow." Eleanor felt a flush of surprise, though not the flattered kind he likely intended. "My lord, I am flattered by your interest, but I have no wish to be settled by anyone's connections. I am content with my position here." "Content," Henry repeated, as though the word amused him. "A woman as clever as you deserves more than contentment, Miss Whitmore. Think on it at least. I do not ask for an answer today." Before Eleanor could reply further, a shadow fell across the path. She turned to find the Duke standing a short distance away, his expression carefully composed, though something tense simmered just beneath its surface. "Henry," the Duke said, his voice cool, "I did not realize you had taken to discussing private matters with my sister's governess in my gardens." "No harm intended, Alexander," Henry said easily, though Eleanor noticed a flicker of something calculating cross his features before it smoothed away. "Merely passing conversation." "See that it remains merely conversation," the Duke said, his tone leaving little room for argument. "Miss Whitmore has responsibilities to attend to." Henry inclined his head, offering Eleanor one last charming smile, before strolling off toward the house, leaving an uncomfortable silence in his wake. Eleanor turned to find the Duke watching her, his expression unreadable once more, though the tension in his shoulders had not fully eased. "Are you well, Miss Whitmore?" he asked finally. "Quite well, Your Grace," she said. "Lord Ashford was simply being forward." "He often is," the Duke said, something sharp coloring his tone. "You need not entertain his attentions if they are unwelcome. I will see that he does not trouble you again." "That is not necessary," Eleanor said quickly, though she was not entirely certain why she felt the need to protest. "I am capable of managing Lord Ashford myself." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering across his face. "Of that," he said quietly, "I have no doubt." He turned then, and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the garden, with Maggie's laughter drifting from among the roses, and a strange, unsettled feeling lodged firmly in her chest. She did not understand it yet, this quiet tension that had begun to build between herself and the Duke, but she was beginning to suspect that whatever it was, it would not remain quiet for very much longer. That evening at dinner, the atmosphere in the dining hall was noticeably strained. Henry attempted several times to draw Eleanor into conversation, complimenting her insights on a book they had briefly discussed days earlier. But each attempt was met with terse interjections from the Duke, redirecting the conversation with an efficiency that bordered on rudeness. Maggie, sensing the tension, though not understanding its cause, grew quieter than usual, glancing between her brother and Eleanor with obvious confusion. After dinner, as Eleanor helped settle Maggie for the night, the girl finally voiced what had clearly been troubling her. "Why was Alexander so cross tonight?" she asked, climbing into bed. "He is never cross like that, not even when I spill ink on his papers." "I am not certain," Eleanor said honestly, tucking the blankets around her. "Perhaps he is simply tired." "Mrs. Feld says he gets like that when he is jealous," Maggie said, matter-of-factly, as though this were common knowledge. "She said he was jealous of Lord Ashford, talking to you in the garden." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm despite herself. "Mrs. Feld should not be discussing such things with you, Maggie. I heard her talking to the cook. Maggie said with a shrug, entirely unbothered by the impropriety of eavesdropping. She said Alexander has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you since before Miss Carlyle left. Eleanor did not know how to respond to this, so she simply pressed a gentle kiss to the girl's forehead and bid her good night, leaving the room before Maggie could offer any further unwelcome insights into her brother's supposed feelings. Alone in the hallway, Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady the strange, fluttering feeling that had taken root there. She told herself it was nonsense, the idle gossip of servants and the innocent observations of a child who understood far less than she believed she did. And yet, she could not fully shake the memory of the Duke's tense expression in the garden, nor the sharp edge in his voice when he had spoken to Lord Ashford. She did not know what it meant, not yet, but she suspected, with a mixture of fear and something she refused to name, that she was about to find out. Lord Ashford did not take Eleanor's polite refusal as an ending. Over the following days, his attentions grew bolder rather than fading, as though her resistance had only sharpened his interest. He appeared in the library when she went searching for books. He offered to accompany her and Maggie on their afternoon walks, inserting himself into moments that had once belonged only to the two of them. He sent, on one particularly uncomfortable morning, a small bouquet of hothouse flowers to her room, accompanied by a note expressing his continued admiration. Eleanor did not want the flowers, nor the attention that came with them, but she found herself unsure how to firmly discourage a guest of the household without causing unnecessary conflict. She placed the flowers in a vase in the schoolroom, telling herself they would simply serve as a decoration for Maggie's lessons, and tried to put the matter from her mind. The Duke, however, seemed entirely unable to do the same. She noticed it in the careful way he began positioning himself near her whenever Henry was in the room, as though standing guard against some threat only he could see. She noticed it in the terse, clipped replies he offered whenever Henry addressed him directly, a stark contrast to the easy friendship they had apparently once shared. She noticed it, most of all, in the way his eyes would find hers across a room and linger there, dark and searching, before he caught himself and looked away. It came to a head one evening at a small gathering the Duke had reluctantly agreed to host, a modest ball attended by several families from the surrounding estates. Eleanor had not expected to be included, given her position, but Maggie had begged so persistently to have her governess present that the Duke had relented, instructing Mrs. Feld to see that Eleanor was given a suitable dress for the occasion. She had not expected to feel so out of place standing among the assembled guests in pale blue silk, her hair arranged in a manner far grander than she was accustomed to. She had not expected, either, the way the Duke's gaze had settled on her the moment she entered the ballroom, sharp and unblinking, as though he had forgotten, briefly, how to look away. "You look lovely, Miss Whitmore," Henry said, appearing at her side, with his usual easy smile, offering his arm, before she could think of a graceful way to decline. "Might I have this dance?" Eleanor hesitated only a moment before accepting, telling herself it was simply the polite thing to do, that refusing a guest in front of the assembled company would draw more attention than accepting ever could. She allowed him to lead her onto the floor, aware, even as the music began, of the Duke's gaze following their every movement from across the room. Henry was, she had to admit, a skilled dancer, guiding her through the steps with practiced ease, filling the silence with easy compliments and light conversation. But Eleanor found her attention repeatedly drawn away from him, toward the Duke standing near the edge of the room, his expression growing darker with every turn of the dance. "You seem distracted, Miss Whitmore," Henry observed, following her gaze with a knowing look. "Perhaps by my old friend Alexander?" "I am simply enjoying the music, my lord," Eleanor said, though the lie sat uncomfortably on her tongue. Henry chuckled softly. "He was never like this before, you know. Before you arrived, I mean. Cold, certainly. Guarded, always. But not like this." Eleanor did not know how to respond, so she said nothing at all, grateful when the dance finally concluded, and she was able to step away with a polite curtsy. She had barely made it to the edge of the room, intending to find a quiet corner to catch her breath, when the Duke appeared at her side, his expression tightly controlled, but his eyes betraying something far less composed. "Might I have a word, Miss Whitmore?" he said, his voice low. "Of course, Your Grace." He led her toward a quiet alcove just beyond the ballroom, away from the noise and the watchful eyes of the guests. Once they were alone, he seemed almost uncertain how to begin, his usual composure momentarily abandoning him. "You danced with him," he said finally, the words carrying an edge she had not expected. "He asked, and I did not think it wise to refuse a guest in your own home," Eleanor said carefully. "Is something wrong, Your Grace?" "Wrong," he repeated, as though testing the word. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a rare display of frustration. "I do not know what is wrong with me, Miss Whitmore. I find myself unable to think clearly whenever he is near you. I find myself watching you far more than I have any right to." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Your Grace, I know it is not my place," he continued, as though he could not stop the words now that they had begun. "I know you are here to teach my sister, not to entertain the confused feelings of her brother, but I cannot seem to help it, and I find that troubling in ways I do not fully understand." The alcove felt suddenly very small, the distance between them shrinking, without either of them moving. Eleanor's heart pounded loudly in her ears, drowning out the distant music from the ballroom. "Your Grace," she said softly, "I do not know what you wish me to say." "I do not wish you to say anything," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper now. "I only wished you to know." He was close now, closer than propriety allowed, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes, searching for something she could not quite name. Eleanor found herself leaning imperceptibly closer, drawn by a pull she did not fully understand and could not seem to resist. "Alexander," she breathed, using his given name for the first time, the word feeling both foreign and inevitable on her tongue. Whatever might have happened next was interrupted by the sudden approach of footsteps and the bright, unwelcome sound of Henry's voice calling out from the ballroom entrance. "Alexander, there you are. Miss Whitmore, your presence has been requested by Lady Margaret. I believe she wishes you to see her curtsy to the assembled guests." The moment shattered instantly. The Duke stepped back, his expression closing off once more, the careful composure sliding back into place like a mask he had momentarily forgotten to wear. Eleanor felt the loss of that closeness like a physical ache, though she quickly schooled her own features into something more neutral. "Of course," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I should attend to Lady Margaret." She left the alcove without looking back, though she could feel the weight of the Duke's gaze following her the entire way, and she suspected, with a strange mixture of hope and fear, that whatever had passed between them in that quiet corner had not been imagined by either of them. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. Eleanor smiled and curtsied and praised Maggie's manners to the assembled guests, all while her mind remained fixed on the alcove and the words the Duke had spoken there. She danced once more, this time with an elderly gentleman who spoke at length about his prized horses, grateful for the distraction it provided from her own tumultuous thoughts. It was near the end of the evening, as guests began taking their leave, that Henry found her alone once more near the refreshment table. "You should be careful, Miss Whitmore," he said, his tone losing some of its earlier charm, something colder creeping in beneath the surface. "Alexander is not a man accustomed to caring for anyone beyond what duty requires of him. Do not mistake a moment's confusion for genuine affection. You would not be the first woman to make that error where he is concerned." "I appreciate your concern, my lord," Eleanor said carefully, "though I did not ask for it." Henry's expression flickered, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, before the charming smile returned, though it no longer reached quite as convincingly. "No," he said, "I suppose you did not. Good night, Miss Whitmore." He left her standing alone by the refreshment table, his words lingering uncomfortably despite her attempt to dismiss them. She did not know Henry well enough to understand what had prompted such a warning, whether it stemmed from genuine concern or something far more self-serving, but she found she could not entirely shake the unease it left behind. Later that night, long after the last guests had departed and the great house had settled into silence, Eleanor sat by her window once more, replaying the events of the evening in her mind. She thought of the Duke's confession in the alcove, the raw honesty in his voice, so different from his usual careful reserve. She thought of the way he had looked at her, as though she were the only person in the entire crowded ballroom worth seeing. She thought, too, of Henry's warning, and wondered which version of the truth she ought to believe. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it, to find Mrs. Feld standing in the corridor, her expression uncharacteristically gentle. "His Grace asked me to see that you had returned safely to your room," the housekeeper said. "He seemed troubled this evening." "Did he say why?" Eleanor asked, unable to help herself. Mrs. Feld's mouth curved into a small, knowing smile. "I believe you already know why, Miss Whitmore. Good night." She left before Eleanor could respond, leaving her alone once more with her racing thoughts and the lingering warmth of a moment in a quiet alcove that she suspected would change everything that followed, whether either of them was fully ready for it or not. Over the days that followed, an unspoken tension settled over the household, subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. The Duke found reasons to be present wherever Eleanor happened to be, his excuses growing thinner with each occurrence, though neither of them acknowledged aloud what was happening between them. Henry, sensing perhaps that his position had weakened considerably after the ball, grew quieter in his pursuit, though his gaze remained watchful, calculating, as though waiting for an opportunity he had not yet found. Eleanor tried, in the privacy of her own thoughts, to make sense of what she felt. She told herself repeatedly that nothing could come of whatever strange connection had formed between herself and the Duke, that the gulf between their stations was simply too wide to bridge, no matter how his eyes lingered, or how her own heart had begun, unwillingly, to respond in kind. But reason, she was quickly discovering, held little power over a heart that had already begun to choose for itself, regardless of what wisdom or caution advised. She did not yet know that matters between them were about to come to a head in a way neither of them could have anticipated, nor that the question the Duke would soon ask her, in a moment of unguarded jealousy, would change the course of everything that followed. In the meantime, small moments continued to accumulate between them, each one adding weight to the connection neither was yet willing to name aloud. One rainy afternoon, when the weather kept Maggie confined indoors and restless, Eleanor organized a simple game of cards in the drawing room to occupy the girl's energy. Alexander, passing by on his way to his study, paused in the doorway, drawn by the sound of Maggie's delighted laughter. "May I join?" he asked, somewhat awkwardly, as though uncertain whether such an ordinary request suited his position. "Of course," Eleanor said, gesturing to the empty seat beside his sister, "though I should warn you, Maggie is a rather ruthless opponent." "I learned from the best," Maggie said proudly, shuffling the cards with exaggerated confidence. What followed was an hour of unexpected lightness, the Duke laughing more freely than Eleanor had yet witnessed, teasing his sister over her card strategy, catching Eleanor's eye across the table with a warmth that made her pulse quicken each time. When Maggie finally declared herself the winner and skipped off to inform Mrs. Feld of her victory, Alexander lingered behind, seemingly reluctant to let the comfortable moment end. "I cannot recall the last time I spent an afternoon so pleasantly," he admitted, gathering the scattered cards with unnecessary care, simply to prolong the conversation. "You have a way of making this house feel different, Miss Whitmore, lighter, somehow, than it has felt in years." "Perhaps the house was always capable of such lightness," Eleanor said gently. "It simply needed a reason to remember it." He looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them before he cleared his throat and excused himself, leaving Eleanor alone, with the deck of cards, and a growing certainty that whatever she felt for this careful, guarded man was no longer something she could dismiss as simple fancy. Word of Lord Ashford's continued attentions toward Eleanor eventually reached beyond the walls of Ashcombe Hall, carried by servants' gossip into the wider circle of local society. A neighboring family mentioned it in passing during a visit, remarking with poorly disguised curiosity on whether the Duke intended to allow his old friend to court his sister's governess so openly. Alexander's response to the inquiry, though carefully worded, revealed more of his true feelings than he perhaps intended, his jaw tightening and his tone growing clipped in a manner that left the visiting family exchanging knowing glances as they departed. Eleanor, unaware of this particular exchange, continued her days much as before, though she found herself increasingly conscious of how often her thoughts drifted toward the Duke during quiet moments, how eagerly she anticipated his presence at meals, how disappointed she felt on the rare occasions his duties kept him away from the house entirely. She recognized, with growing unease, that whatever careful boundaries she had intended to maintain between herself and her employer had begun, quite without her permission, to dissolve entirely. The matter came to a head on an ordinary afternoon, in a manner none of them had anticipated. Eleanor had taken Maggie into the village for a small errand, a visit to the tailor for new ribbons, and a stop at the bakery Maggie adored. It was there, standing outside the bakery with a paper bag of warm bread in her hands, that Henry found them once more, seemingly by chance, though Eleanor was beginning to suspect very little Henry did was truly by chance. "What a pleasant surprise," he said, falling into step beside them as though invited. "May I walk with you back to the estate? The roads can be uncertain this time of day." Eleanor wanted to refuse, but Maggie had already begun chattering happily to Henry about the bread and the ribbons, and refusing outright would have meant an unpleasant scene in the middle of the village. She agreed, reluctantly, and the three of them made their way back toward Ashcombe Hall together. It was unfortunate timing, then, that the Duke happened to be returning from a ride at the very same moment, his horse cresting the hill, just as Henry offered his arm to Eleanor, to help her over an uneven patch of road, a gesture entirely unnecessary, but one Henry had insisted upon with his usual practiced charm. Eleanor saw the Duke's expression shift the moment he spotted them, his jaw tightening, his hands pulling sharply on the reins, as he brought his horse to a stop nearby. He dismounted quickly, his movements stiff with barely restrained tension. "Alexander!" Henry called out easily, releasing Eleanor's arm, as though nothing had happened. "We were just returning from the village. Miss Whitmore's company made for a pleasant walk." "I imagine it did," the Duke said, his voice carrying an edge that made even Maggie fall silent, glancing between her brother and the two adults with wide, uncertain eyes. "Maggie," Eleanor said quickly, sensing the tension building, "why don't you take the bread inside to Mrs. Feld before it grows cold?" Maggie, sensing an excuse to escape the sudden strain in the air, nodded eagerly and hurried off toward the house, leaving Eleanor alone with the two men, and a silence that had grown almost unbearable. Henry, apparently deciding discretion was the better course, offered a brief bow and excused himself as well, claiming some errand of his own that required his attention, leaving Eleanor alone with the Duke on the quiet road. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The Duke's horse shifted restlessly beside him, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out into the afternoon air, the only sound to break the heavy silence between them. "Your Grace," Eleanor began carefully, "I did not invite Lord Ashford's company." "He simply, who's been pursuing you?" the Duke interrupted suddenly, the question tearing from him with a rawness that startled them both. His hands had curled into fists at his sides, his composure fraying in a way she had never witnessed before. "Ashford follows you everywhere. Sends you flowers. Walks with you in the village. Am I meant to simply stand by and watch as he pursues you openly, day after day, while I say nothing?" Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, torn between the sting of his accusatory tone and the raw vulnerability beneath it. She could see, in the tightness of his jaw and the desperate edge in his eyes, that this was not truly about Henry at all. It was about everything neither of them had allowed themselves to say since that night in the alcove. "You wish to know who has been pursuing me," she said slowly, her own voice steadier than she expected, though her heart pounded fiercely against her ribs. "Very well. I will tell you plainly, Your Grace, since plain speech has always served me well." He said nothing, only watched her, waiting, his expression caught somewhere between dread and desperate hope. "It was never Lord Ashford who caught my attention," Eleanor said. "Not once, not for a single moment, despite his flowers and his compliments and his walks through the village. From the very first week I arrived at Ashcombe Hall, soaked through and frightened and uncertain of my place in this world, there has been only one person whose opinion of me mattered, whose presence in a room I noticed before anyone else's, whose voice I found myself listening for even when I told myself I should not. It was you, Your Grace. It has always been you." The Duke went utterly still, his expression frozen somewhere between disbelief and something far more fragile. For a long moment, he did not speak at all, and Eleanor wondered, with a rush of sudden panic, if she had misread everything between them entirely. If she had just handed him a confession he had no intention of returning. "Say that again," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "It has always been you," Eleanor repeated, her cheeks flushing warm, despite the coolness of the afternoon air. I did not intend to feel this way. I know my position here. I know the impossibility of it, but you asked, and I promised myself long ago that I would never lie, simply because the truth was inconvenient. The Duke took a step closer, his earlier tension replaced by something far softer, far more uncertain than she had ever seen from him. I have spent weeks convincing myself that what I felt was foolishness, he said quietly, that a man in my position had no business allowing himself to care for his sister's governess, no matter how much he found himself doing precisely that, despite every effort to stop it. And now? Eleanor asked softly. Now, he said, closing the remaining distance between them. I find myself entirely unable to remember why I ever thought stopping it was wise. He reached out, hesitantly, as though still uncertain of his welcome, and gently took her hand in his. Eleanor did not pull away. She stood there on the quiet road, her hand held gently in his, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the path, and felt, for the first time since her father's death, that perhaps the world had not entirely abandoned her to uncertainty and struggle after all. This changes nothing about the difficulty of our positions, the Duke said quietly, though his thumb traced a gentle line across her knuckles as he spoke. Society will not easily accept a Duke courting his sister's governess. There will be talk. There will be those who believe I have lost all sense. I am aware of the difficulty, Your Grace, Eleanor said, though she found she could not quite bring herself to be troubled by it, not with his hand still holding hers so gently. I have never expected an easy path in life. I do not require one now. Something in his expression softened further at her words, a small, genuine smile breaking through his usual guarded reserve, transforming his face into something Eleanor had not yet seen, something younger and less burdened than the composed Duke she had grown accustomed to. You are remarkable, Miss Whitmore, he said softly. Eleanor, she corrected gently. If we are to speak so plainly with one another, I believe formalities have served their purpose. Eleanor, he repeated, testing the name with obvious pleasure. Alexander, then, when we are alone. They stood together on the quiet road for a long moment longer, neither quite ready to break the fragile new understanding that had formed between them, before the practical matters of the world intruded once more, and they made their way back toward the house, walking a respectful distance apart, though the air between them had shifted entirely. Inside, Maggie greeted them both with delighted curiosity, clearly sensing that something had changed, though not entirely certain what. Mrs. Feld, observing the pair from the kitchen doorway, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile before returning to her tasks, saying nothing but clearly pleased by whatever she had witnessed pass between them. That evening, Eleanor found herself smiling to herself throughout dinner, catching the Duke's gaze across the table more than once, each glance carrying a warmth that had been entirely absent in their earlier, more formal exchanges. Henry, seated at the far end of the table, observed the shift between them with a carefully neutral expression, though Eleanor did not miss the calculating glint that flickered briefly in his eyes before he masked it once more behind his usual charming smile. She did not yet know how significant that flicker would prove to be, nor how quickly the fragile happiness she had found would be tested by forces neither she nor the Duke had fully anticipated. For now, though, she allowed herself simply to enjoy the warmth of a connection she had never expected to find, especially not in the guarded, careful heart of a Duke who had sworn, after his last heartbreak, never to risk such vulnerability again. As the evening wound to a close and the household began settling into its usual quiet routines, the Duke found a moment alone with Eleanor in the corridor outside the schoolroom, Maggie having already been sent off to bed with a story and a kiss goodnight. I meant what I said earlier, he told her quietly, his voice carrying a sincerity that made her chest ache with something warm and unfamiliar. Whatever difficulties lie ahead, I do not intend to let fear of them keep me from this. From you. Nor I, Eleanor said softly. He reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering a moment longer than necessary, before finally stepping back with obvious reluctance. Good night, Eleanor, he said. Good night, Alexander, she replied, watching him disappear down the corridor before finally retreating to her own room, her heart lighter than it had been in longer than she could remember, entirely unaware of the storm that Henry's wounded pride and careful scheming was already beginning to set into motion behind the scenes. The days that followed brought a quiet happiness Eleanor had never allowed herself to imagine. Small moments passed between herself and Alexander, a shared glance across the breakfast table, a walk through the gardens that lingered far longer than necessary, a stolen conversation in the library after Maggie had gone to bed. Nothing improper occurred between them, nothing that could yet draw the notice of the household staff or the watchful eyes of guests. But the warmth between them had become undeniable to anyone paying close enough attention. Maggie noticed first, as children often do, delighting openly in the change she observed in her brother. He laughed more easily now, joined her in games he once claimed were beneath his dignity, and seemed, in every visible way, lighter than he had been in years. She took to finding excuses to leave Eleanor and Alexander alone together, a child's clumsy but well-meaning attempt at matchmaking that both adults found equally amusing and endearing. It was Henry, however, who watched the growing closeness between them with an entirely different expression, one that had shed nearly all pretense of charm in the privacy of his own thoughts, though he maintained his easy smile whenever company was present. He had not come to Ashcombe Hall merely for a pleasant visit with an old friend, though few beyond himself knew the true nature of his circumstances. His family's fortune, once considerable, had dwindled significantly over the past several years due to poor investments and worse decisions. He had come seeking a wealthy marriage to restore what had been lost, and Eleanor, with her modest beauty and sharp intelligence, had seemed a pleasant diversion at first, a woman he could charm easily given her lowly position and presumed gratitude for any attention from a man of his rank. Her continued rejection had wounded his pride considerably, but it was the realization that Alexander himself had fallen for her that turned wounded pride into something far more dangerous. Henry had always resented, quietly, the ease with which Alexander had inherited his title and fortune, while Henry's own family struggled to maintain even the appearance of their former standing. Watching his old friend find happiness with a woman Henry had wanted for himself proved more than his fragile pride could bear. He began, carefully and quietly, to search for a way to unravel what had formed between them. It did not take him long to find one. During a visit to the village, ostensibly to purchase supplies for his continued stay, Henry made careful inquiries among the local shopkeepers and residents, probing gently into Eleanor's background under the guise of idle curiosity. It was from an elderly seamstress, eager to share what little gossip she knew with a charming lord willing to listen, that Henry learned something Eleanor herself had never spoken of at Ashcombe Hall. Her father, before his death, had not simply left behind debts from poor circumstance. He had been involved, some years prior, in a business scheme that had ultimately failed, leaving several local families financially ruined in its wake. It had not been outright deception on her father's part, merely poor judgment and worse luck, but the resentment among those affected had lingered long after his passing, and Eleanor herself, though entirely innocent of any wrongdoing, had left the area shortly after his death, rather than face the lingering hostility of neighbors who blamed her family for their losses. It was not scandal of the sort that would ruin her entirely, but it was enough, Henry realized with grim satisfaction, to plant doubt in the mind of a duke deeply concerned with his family's reputation, and standing among the very peers whose good opinion he had spent his entire life carefully cultivating. He returned to Ashcombe Hall that evening, with a plan already forming, waiting patiently for the right moment to set it into motion. The opportunity came sooner than he expected, during a dinner attended by several prominent families from neighboring estates, guests Alexander had invited weeks earlier, before his feelings for Eleanor had fully taken root. Henry, seated near enough to overhear the conversation, waited until a natural lull settled over the table before speaking, his tone carefully casual. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I could not help but notice, during my visit to the village, that your family name seemed familiar to several of the residents there. Whitmore, was it not associated with some unfortunate business venture some years back?" The table fell into an uncomfortable silence. Eleanor felt the color drain from her face as every eye turned toward her, including Alexander's, his expression shifting from confusion to concern in the span of a heartbeat. "I am not certain what you mean, my lord," Eleanor said carefully, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor she could not fully suppress. "Forgive me if I have spoken out of turn," Henry said, his tone dripping with false innocence. "I only thought it worth mentioning, given the circumstances." It seems your father's business dealings left quite an impression on the local families. Not entirely a favorable one, from what I understand. Whispers began among the assembled guests, the particular kind of hushed, judgmental murmuring that spread through society gatherings faster than any fire. Eleanor sat frozen, uncertain how to defend herself against an accusation she had not even fully understood the details of, her father having shielded her from the worst of the business failure's consequences during his lifetime. "That is quite enough, Henry," Alexander said sharply, his voice carrying a warning that silenced the table instantly. "Whatever occurred in Miss Whitmore's family history has no bearing on her character or her position in this household. But the damage, subtle as it was, had already been done." Eleanor could see it in the exchanged glances among the guests, the careful reassessment happening behind polite, composed expressions. She excused herself from the table as soon as propriety allowed, retreating to her room with her heart pounding and her thoughts racing. Alexander found her there an hour later, having extracted himself from his remaining guests as quickly as courtesy permitted. "Eleanor," he said gently, knocking softly before entering at her quiet permission. "Are you well?" "I did not know," she said quietly, staring out her window rather than meeting his eyes. "My father never spoke of the details. I knew only that we left our previous home rather suddenly, that there had been financial troubles, but I did not know the full extent of what had happened, nor that it had harmed others so directly." "It does not matter," Alexander said firmly, moving to sit beside her. "Whatever your father's mistakes, they are not your own. I do not hold you responsible for decisions made before you had any say in them. Your guests may not share such generous sentiments," Eleanor said, finally turning to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears she refused to let fall. "You have spent your entire life protecting your family's reputation, Alexander. I have seen how carefully you guard it. A governess with a scandal attached to her family name is not the sort of connection that protects a duke's standing." "My standing," Alexander said, his voice hardening slightly, though not toward her, "has never mattered to me, nearly as much as you seem to believe it does. I have played the part expected of me for years, because it was expected, not because I found genuine value in society's opinion of my family name." "And if that changes," Eleanor pressed, "if continuing to care for me costs you the respect of your peers, the trust of families you must maintain relationships with for Maggie's future, for the estate's continued prosperity, I cannot ask you to sacrifice all of that for my sake." "You are not asking," Alexander said quietly. "I am choosing it, freely, and I would choose it again regardless of the cost." Eleanor wanted desperately to believe him, and in that quiet moment, sitting close beside him with his hand gently covering hers, she nearly did. But doubt, once planted, has a way of taking root regardless of reassurance, and Eleanor found herself unable to fully silence the fear that she had brought unwanted trouble into a household that had only just begun to feel like it might, someday, become a true home for her. Over the following days, the whispers among the household staff and the lingering coolness from some of the neighboring families who had attended the dinner made the situation impossible to ignore. Mrs. Feld remained fiercely loyal, dismissing the gossip with sharp words whenever she encountered it among the other servants. But even her loyalty could not fully shield Eleanor from the growing sense that her presence at Ashcombe Hall had become, however unfairly, a liability. Henry, satisfied with the seeds of doubt he had planted, pressed his advantage further during a private conversation with Alexander, framed carefully as concerned friendship rather than the calculated manipulation it truly was. "I only wish to see you happy, Alexander," Henry said, settling into a chair in the study with practiced ease. "But you must consider the broader implications. Your marriage, whenever it comes, will affect more than your own happiness. It will affect Maggie's prospects, the tenant families who depend on this estate's continued standing, the alliances your father worked so carefully to build. Miss Whitmore is a fine woman, certainly, but is she truly worth risking all of that?" "You speak as though my happiness matters less than the opinions of people who will find something to gossip about regardless of my choices," Alexander said, though Eleanor, had she been present to witness the exchange, would have noticed the slight uncertainty creeping into his otherwise firm tone. "I speak as someone who has watched you carry the weight of this family's reputation your entire life," Henry said smoothly. "I only ask that you think carefully before making a decision that cannot easily be undone." Alexander did not respond immediately, and something in his silence gave Henry the satisfaction he had been seeking all along. Seeds of doubt, once planted in fertile enough ground, rarely require much further tending to take firm root. That evening, when Alexander sought Eleanor out once more, something in his manner had shifted, a careful hesitation that had not been present before, and Eleanor, sensitive to every nuance of his expression, after weeks of careful observation, noticed it immediately. "Is something troubling you?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "I have simply been thinking," Alexander said carefully, "about the practical realities of our situation, about what a future together might truly require, and whether I am prepared to ask you to endure the difficulties that would surely accompany it." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest at his words, the careful distance in his tone so different from the warmth she had grown accustomed to over recent weeks. "And what have you concluded?" she asked quietly. "I do not know," he admitted, and the honesty of his uncertainty hurt far more than an outright rejection would have. "I care for you, Eleanor, more deeply than I have cared for anyone in a very long time. But I have responsibilities that extend beyond my own wishes, and I find myself uncertain how to reconcile the two." Eleanor rose slowly from her seat, her chin lifting with the same proud dignity that had carried her through every hardship life had thrown at her thus far. "Then perhaps," she said, her voice steady despite the ache building in her chest, "you should take whatever time you require to reach your conclusions. I will not stand as an obstacle between you and the responsibilities you clearly value so highly." "Eleanor, that is not what I meant." "Perhaps not," she said, "but it is what your hesitation suggests, regardless of your intentions." She left him standing alone in the study, retreating to her room with a heaviness she had not felt since the earliest days following her father's death. She began, that very night, quietly gathering her few belongings, uncertain whether she truly intended to leave Ashcombe Hall, or simply needed to feel some measure of control over a situation that had grown increasingly beyond her ability to influence. She did not yet know that Alexander, alone in his study long after their conversation had ended, sat wrestling with a realization slowly dawning on him, that he had allowed Henry's careful manipulation to plant doubt where none should have existed, and that in doing so, he had come dangerously close to losing the one thing in years that had made him feel truly, unguardedly happy. By morning, Eleanor had made her decision. She would leave Ashcombe Hall before her presence could cause any further difficulty for the family that had, however briefly, begun to feel like her own. Eleanor rose before dawn, dressing quietly in the gray light filtering through her window, her small trunk already packed with the few belongings she had brought with her months earlier. She left a brief note for Maggie, unable to bring herself to write anything more than a promise that she had cared for her deeply and wished her every happiness, before slipping quietly through the corridors of the still sleeping house. She had arranged, the previous evening, for a farmer's cart, heading toward the nearest coaching inn, to carry her away from Ashcombe Hall before the household fully woke. It felt, in some ways, painfully similar to her arrival months earlier, fleeing through uncertain circumstances toward an unknown future. Except this time, she left behind not just a place, but a piece of her heart she suspected she would never fully recover. She had nearly reached the front gates when Mrs. Feld's voice called out sharply behind her. "And where do you think you are going at this hour, Miss Whitmore?" Eleanor turned, startled, to find the housekeeper standing in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the early morning chill, her expression a mixture of concern and disapproval. "I am leaving, Mrs. Feld," Eleanor said simply. "It is better for everyone this way." "Better for everyone," Mrs. Feld repeated, moving closer with surprising speed for a woman of her age. "Better for whom, exactly?" "Certainly not for that child upstairs, who will wake to find her beloved teacher gone, without so much as a proper goodbye. Certainly not for His Grace, who has not slept a single full night since your conversation last evening, if the state of his study is any indication." Eleanor hesitated, her resolve wavering slightly at the mention of Maggie's likely heartbreak. "He did not stop Lord Ashford's accusations at dinner. He hesitated when I needed him to be certain. He is a man who has spent his entire life being certain of nothing but duty and disappointment," Mrs. Feld said, her voice softening. "You cannot expect a heart that has been guarded for years to open fully, without a single moment of fear along the way. But fear is not the same as unwillingness, Miss Whitmore. Give the man a chance to prove which one truly governs his heart before you decide his answer for him." Eleanor stood frozen at the gate, torn between the pull of self-preservation that had carried her safely through so many hardships and the small, stubborn hope that Mrs. Feld's words had reawakened within her chest. Before she could fully decide, the sound of hurried footsteps and a familiar voice calling her name echoed across the courtyard. "Eleanor, wait!" She turned to find Alexander running toward her, still dressed in the disheveled clothes of a man who had clearly not slept, his hair unkempt, his expression wild with something between panic and determination. He skidded to a stop before her, breathing hard, his eyes searching her face, as though committing every detail to memory, in case this proved to be his last chance to do so. "You cannot leave," he said, his voice rough with urgency. "Please, Eleanor, not like this." "You made your uncertainty quite clear last evening, Your Grace," Eleanor said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction, her heart already beginning to betray the careful walls she had tried to rebuild overnight. "I was a fool," Alexander said desperately. "I let Henry's careful words plant doubts that had no business taking root in the first place. I spent the entire night thinking of nothing but the life this house would become without you in it. And I realized, far too late, that whatever difficulties society might present, they mean nothing compared to the prospect of losing you entirely." "Alexander, let me finish," he said, closing the distance between them, his hands reaching for hers with an urgency that left no room for doubt. "I do not care what whispers follow us through society's gatherings. I do not care if some families choose to withdraw their friendship over a decision they have no right to judge. I have spent my entire life protecting a reputation that has brought me little genuine happiness, and I am done sacrificing my heart on the altar of other people's opinions." Eleanor felt tears finally slipping free, unable to hold them back any longer. What of Henry's revelations? My father's failures, the families who still resent my name? "Your father's mistakes are not yours to carry," Alexander said firmly, and Henry's motives in revealing them were far from the concerned friendship he pretended. "I confronted him after you retired for the evening. He confessed, eventually, that his own family's fortunes have fallen considerably, and that he had hoped to secure a wealthy match through either yourself or, failing that, through continued closeness to my own family's standing. His revelation of your father's history was calculated, meant to create exactly the doubt and distance it very nearly succeeded in creating." Eleanor absorbed this revelation slowly, pieces of Henry's behavior over recent weeks suddenly falling into a far more troubling pattern than she had previously understood. "He has already left then." "This very morning, before dawn," Alexander confirmed. "I made it quite clear that his welcome at Ashcombe Hall had thoroughly expired, and that any further attempts to interfere in matters that no longer concerned him would be met with considerably less patience than I have shown thus far." Eleanor let out a shaky breath, relief and lingering hurt mingling together in her chest. "You still hesitated, Alexander, even knowing what you knew. Even before Henry's confession, you allowed doubt to creep into what we had built." "I did," he admitted, his grip on her hands tightening slightly, as though afraid she might still slip away despite everything. "I will not pretend otherwise, nor will I ask you to simply forget that hesitation occurred, but I am asking you to believe that a moment of fear, however painful its consequences, does not define the entirety of what I feel for you, nor what I am prepared to fight for, now that I have had time to fully understand what losing you would truly mean." Mrs. Feld, who had remained quietly nearby throughout the exchange, cleared her throat gently. "Perhaps," she suggested, "this conversation would benefit from slightly more privacy than a courtyard at dawn provides." Alexander managed a small, grateful smile toward the housekeeper before turning his full attention back to Eleanor. "Come inside," he said softly. "Please, let us talk properly, without the fear of dawn coaches and hasty departures hanging over us." Eleanor hesitated only a moment longer before nodding, allowing him to gently take her small trunk from her hands and lead her back toward the house she had so nearly left behind forever. They settled in the quiet privacy of his study, the early morning light beginning to fill the room with soft golden warmth as the household slowly began to stir around them. "I meant what I said in the courtyard," Alexander told her, once they were settled, his hand still holding hers, as though unwilling to relinquish the connection, now that he had finally reclaimed it. I am prepared to face whatever consequences arise from choosing you, Eleanor. Society's judgment, the families who may withdraw their friendship, even the whispered scandals that will inevitably follow, none of it holds the weight I once believed it did, not when measured against the prospect of a lifetime without you. And Maggie? Eleanor asked softly. What will this mean for her? Maggie adores you, Alexander said, a genuine smile finally breaking through his earlier tension. I suspect she will be considerably more delighted by this outcome than distressed by any social consequences she is far too young to fully understand or care about. As if summoned by the mention of her name, a soft knock sounded at the study door, before it creaked open to reveal Maggie herself, still in her nightgown, her expression anxious, as her eyes found Eleanor sitting safely within the room. You did not leave, Maggie said, relief flooding her young face, as she rushed forward to wrap her arms around Eleanor's waist. I found your note. I thought you had gone forever. I very nearly did, Eleanor admitted, gently stroking the girl's hair. But your brother convinced me to stay. Maggie glanced between Eleanor and Alexander, her sharp young mind quickly piecing together the significance of the moment, despite the adult's careful attempts to maintain some measure of composure. Does this mean you will stay properly? She asked. Not just as my teacher, but as something more? Alexander laughed softly, a warm, unguarded sound Eleanor had rarely heard from him before that morning. That, little one, is precisely what I intend, provided Miss Whitmore is willing to have me, despite my earlier foolishness. All eyes turned to Eleanor, who felt her own smile finally breaking through the lingering traces of the night's worry and doubt. I believe, she said slowly, savoring the moment, that I am entirely willing, Your Grace, provided you promise never to let doubt so thoroughly overshadow your certainty again. You have my word, Alexander said solemnly, though the warmth in his eyes suggested a happiness far too great to be contained by formal promises alone. The weeks that followed brought considerable change to Ashcombe Hall. News of the Duke's intentions toward his sister's former governess spread quickly through local society, generating exactly the whispered scandal Alexander had predicted, though far less severe than either of them had feared. Several families did indeed withdraw their friendship, unable to accept a match they viewed as beneath the Duke's station, but far more chose, in the end, to accept the couple's evident happiness, particularly once it became clear that Alexander's determination on the matter would not be swayed by disapproval. Mrs. Feld took considerable satisfaction in overseeing preparations for a wedding that would take place within the season. Her earlier disapproval of the stranger, who had arrived soaked and desperate months before, having long since transformed into genuine affection and pride. Maggie, delighted beyond measure at the prospect of gaining not just a beloved teacher but a proper sister, threw herself into the wedding preparations with an enthusiasm that brought laughter and warmth back into a household that had spent too many years shadowed by old heartbreak. Henry, for his part, was never seen at Ashcombe Hall again, his scheming ultimately costing him far more than the wealthy match he had hoped to secure through his manipulations. Word eventually reached the estate that his family's fortunes had continued their decline, and whatever satisfaction Eleanor might have once taken in his downfall was tempered by simple relief that his influence no longer held any power over the happiness she had finally, fully claimed for herself. On the day of the wedding, Eleanor stood before the small gathering of friends and family who had chosen to celebrate rather than condemn the unconventional match, her heart full in a way she had never imagined possible during those uncertain, rain-soaked days when she had first arrived at Ashcombe Hall, with nothing but a small trunk and a desperate need for steady wages. Alexander stood waiting for her, his earlier guarded reserve entirely absent, replaced by open, unguarded joy that transformed his entire bearing. "Who's been pursuing you?" he whispered teasingly as she reached his side, echoing the question that had changed everything between them months before. "You," Eleanor whispered back, her smile matching his own. "Only ever you." As they exchanged their vows beneath the soft afternoon sun, surrounded by a household that had become her true family, in every way that mattered, Eleanor reflected on the long, uncertain path that had brought her to this moment. She thought of her father, of the debts and hardships that had first driven her from everything familiar, of the storm she had run through on her very first day at Ashcombe Hall, never imagining that the cold, guarded Duke waiting on those front steps would one day become the very center of her entire world. Some hardships, she realized, existed only to lead a person exactly where they were always meant to be, and as Alexander's hand tightened around hers, his eyes shining with a happiness neither of them had believed themselves capable of finding, Eleanor understood, with complete certainty, that every difficult step of her journey had been worth it, every single time, for this. The first year of their marriage brought changes neither Eleanor nor Alexander had fully anticipated, though none of the difficulties that arose proved insurmountable, given the strength of the bond they had built. Eleanor settled into her new role, with the same quiet determination that had carried her through every previous hardship, learning the considerable responsibilities that came with managing a great household while continuing, whenever her duties allowed, to spend cherished hours in the schoolroom with Maggie, unwilling to relinquish entirely the role that had first brought her into this family's life. Not every family in the surrounding countryside came to accept the match easily. Lady Prescott, a formidable widow who had once hoped her own niece might secure the Duke's affections, made her disapproval known through carefully worded remarks disguised as polite conversation whenever their paths crossed at local gatherings. Eleanor bore these comments with the same steady dignity she had always possessed, refusing to let unkind words diminish the happiness she had fought so hard to claim. And slowly, over months of consistent grace under pressure, even Lady Prescott's coldness began to thaw into grudging respect. A greater test arrived when Alexander's distant cousin, a man named Edmund, who stood to inherit the title, should Alexander produce no direct heir, arrived at Ashcombe Hall under the guise of a family visit. Eleanor recognized immediately the same calculating watchfulness she had once seen in Henry, though Edmund's approach proved subtler, his comments about the estate's future and the importance of proper lineage, delivered with careful, deniable politeness, rather than open scheming. Alexander, having learned hard lessons from the events surrounding Henry's betrayal, addressed the situation directly, rather than allowing doubt to fester unspoken. He confronted Edmund plainly one evening in the study, making clear that Eleanor's position within the family was unshakable, regardless of any hopes Edmund might harbor regarding inheritance, and that continued insinuations of the sort he had been making would not be tolerated under his roof. Edmund departed within the week, his ambitions thwarted by a Duke no longer willing to let unspoken doubts undermine the life he had chosen. It was Maggie, now approaching her 12th year, who perhaps benefited most visibly from the stability Eleanor's presence had brought to the household. The anxious, uncertain girl, who had once shrunk from correction, had grown into a confident, curious young woman, excelling in her studies and approaching the world with the same steady courage Eleanor had modeled for her since their very first meeting. She often told anyone who would listen that Eleanor had taught her far more than letters and sums, that she had taught her, through simple example, what it meant to face difficulty without losing oneself in the process. Eleanor and Alexander welcomed their first child, a daughter they named after Eleanor's late mother, in the spring of their second year together. The birth brought its own quiet joys and challenges, Alexander proving himself, much to Mrs. Feld's evident delight, an attentive and devoted father, despite his early uncertainty about his own capabilities where children were concerned. Watching him hold his infant daughter with the same careful tenderness he had once struggled to show even Maggie, Eleanor understood fully how completely he had shed the guarded reserve that had once defined him. There were, of course, ordinary difficulties that accompanied any marriage, disagreements over household matters, occasional misunderstandings that required patient conversation to resolve, the natural friction that arises when two people build a shared life together after years of independence. But these difficulties never approached the depth of doubt that had once nearly driven them apart, and each disagreement, however small, only seemed to strengthen the trust they had worked so deliberately to build, following the painful lessons of Henry's betrayal. Years later, when Maggie herself approached marriageable age and faced her own uncertain courtship with a young gentleman from a neighboring estate, it was Eleanor she sought out for guidance, trusting her sister-in-law's hard-won wisdom above any other counsel available to her. "How did you know," Maggie asked one quiet afternoon, "that Alexander was worth the risk, that the difficulties would not outweigh the happiness in the end?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, remembering the frightened young woman who had once run through a storm, with nothing but a small trunk and a desperate hope for stability. "I did not know," Not with any certainty, she admitted. I only knew that some connections are worth the uncertainty they bring, that the fear of difficulty should never outweigh the courage required to reach for genuine happiness when it presents itself. Your brother taught me that lesson as much as I ever taught it to him. Maggie smiled, squeezing Eleanor's hand with the same affection she had shown since their very first meeting in a rain-soaked bedroom years before. Then I suppose I shall have to be brave as well. You already are, Eleanor told her warmly. You always have been, even when you did not believe it of yourself. That evening, as the household settled into its familiar, comfortable rhythms, Eleanor found Alexander waiting for her in the garden, where their story had first truly begun. The same roses Maggie had once wandered among, still blooming steadily, each season, regardless of whatever storms or difficulties the family had weathered in between. He drew her close as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and amber that reminded her, still, of that very first stormy evening so many years before. Any regrets? He asked softly, the old teasing lightness in his voice that had become so natural to him over their years together. Not a single one, Eleanor answered honestly, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched their daughter chase after butterflies nearby, her laughter carrying bright and unburdened across the quiet garden. Every difficult step led exactly here, and I would not trade a moment of the journey, however uncertain it once felt, for anything else in this world. Alexander pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, holding her close as the evening settled peacefully around them, the great house behind them filled with warmth and laughter that had once seemed impossibly distant to a guarded duke who had believed himself incapable of ever again opening his heart so completely. Later that same evening, once their daughter had been carried off to bed by a doting nursemaid, and Maggie had retired to write a long letter to the young gentleman courting her, Eleanor and Alexander remained in the garden a while longer, watching the first stars appear over the darkening hills. She thought of how far they had both traveled since that stormy first meeting on the front steps of this very house, two guarded strangers who had each, in their own way, been waiting for a reason to trust again. "Do you remember?" she asked softly. "How certain you were, that first evening, that I was nothing more than an inconvenience who had wandered onto your land uninvited." Alexander laughed, the sound rich and unguarded in the quiet night air. "I remember thinking you were the most stubborn woman I had ever encountered, standing there soaked through and refusing to be intimidated by anything I said. I did not yet understand that stubbornness would become one of the qualities I came to treasure most." "And I remember thinking you the coldest man I had ever met," Eleanor replied with a fond smile, though I suspect I understood, even then, that the coldness was simply armor, worn by someone who had been hurt too deeply to risk removing it. "You were the only person who ever managed to convince me it was safe to set that armor aside," Alexander said, his voice growing quieter, more solemn. "I do not know that I ever properly thanked you for that." "You have thanked me every day since," Eleanor said, "in 100 small ways I have never once taken for granted." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, listening to the distant sounds of the household settling for the night, the occasional call of an owl from the nearby woods, the soft rustle of wind through the roses that had witnessed the very beginning of everything between them. Eleanor thought of Lady Prescott, who now sent warm invitations to tea rather than veiled insults, having long since come to admire the quiet strength and steady kindness that had never wavered despite years of occasional coldness from society. She thought of the tenant families who had come to respect the Duchess, who took genuine interest in their welfare, who remembered every child's name and every family's circumstances with the same careful attention she had once given to Maggie's early lessons. She thought, most of all, of how a single storm-soaked arrival years ago had quietly reshaped the entire course of her life, leading her not toward the ruin she had once feared, but toward a happiness so complete, she sometimes still marveled at her own good fortune in finding it. Whatever trials still awaited them in the years ahead, they faced them now not as two separate people cautiously guarding their own vulnerabilities, but as true partners, bound together by a love that had proven, time and again, strong enough to weather any storm that dared to test it.